At my daughter's funeral, while I stood over her coffin with my hands trembling, her husband leaned in so close no one else could hear. And in that moment of my deepest grief, he whispered, "This is all your fault, old man." His words didn't just break me, they planted a question in my chest that I have carried ever since. Was he right? I can still feel the weight of that September morning pressing down on my chest. The funeral home had filled the air with lilies, white ones, dozens of them, their heavy perfume so thick it felt like breathing through cotton. I stood in the front pew, my hands folded, watching people file past my daughter's casket with that careful, measured walk that death demands of us all. Sarah looked peaceful, they said, beautiful, even in death. But all I could see was how small she appeared in that polished oak box, smaller than I remembered her being in life. At 32, she should have been vibrant, laughing, maybe calling me on a Sunday evening to ask about my week. Instead, she lay silent while strangers and distant relatives whispered their condolences into the thick, flower-scented air. The service had been everything you'd expect. Pastor Williams spoke about God's plan, about how we don't always understand why good people are taken from us too soon. People nodded, dabbed their eyes with tissues, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I barely heard the words. My mind kept drifting to the last conversation Sarah and I had shared. Brief, formal, the kind of exchange you might have with a neighbor you're polite to, but don't really know. If this story touches something in your heart, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Sometimes, sharing our deepest wounds helps others feel less alone with theirs. Please, leave a comment if you've experienced something similar. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. It was after the service, as people began to mill around, offering their final respects, that everything changed. I was standing near the casket, my hand resting on its edge, when my son-in-law Marcus approached. I'd expected him to be devastated. He was, after all, losing his wife of 8 years. What I didn't expect was the look in his eyes when he stopped beside me. He leaned in close, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. Close enough that no one else could hear what he was about to say. His voice was barely above a whisper, but those 4 words hit me like a physical blow. "This is all your fault." I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. People were still moving around us, still offering their gentle touches and murmured sympathies. Mrs. Henderson from down the street patted my shoulder. Sarah's college roommate squeezed my hand, but all I could hear was Marcus's whisper echoing in my head, growing louder with each repetition. I turned to look at him, to ask what he meant, but he'd already moved away, accepting condolences from other mourners with the composed grief of a proper widower. I stood there, my grip tightening on the edge of the casket until my knuckles went white, wondering if I was losing my mind. Had he really said those words, or was my guilt-ridden conscience putting thoughts into his mouth? But deep in my chest, in that place where fathers keep their darkest fears about their failures, I knew he had spoken the truth. Or at least, a truth. Maybe not the whole truth, maybe not even an accurate truth, but some version of truth that had been festering in his heart since the day Sarah died. The rest of the funeral passed in a haze. People continued to approach me, offering their sympathy, sharing brief memories of Sarah. I nodded, thanked them, accepted their embraces, but I felt like I was watching everything end from somewhere far away. My body went through the motions while my mind kept returning to those 4 words, turning them over like stones, examining them from every angle. When it came time to carry the casket to the hearse, I took my place among the pallbearers. Marcus was directly across from me, and for a moment our eyes met over Sarah's coffin. I searched his face for some explanation, some hint of what had prompted his accusation, but he looked away, his jaw set in a hard line that told me nothing and everything at once. As we walked slowly toward the waiting car, I felt the weight of more than just the casket. I carried with me the growing certainty that there were things about my daughter's life, and her death, that I had never known, never been told, never even thought to ask about. The distance between Marcus and me felt like an ocean, and somewhere in that vast space lay truths I was terrified to discover. That night, I sat in my empty house, still wearing my funeral suit, trying to make sense of what had happened. I replayed every interaction Marcus and I had shared over the years, brief conversations at holiday gatherings, polite exchanges about the weather or work. We'd never been close, but I'd always assumed that was normal. Sons-in-law and fathers-in-law maintain a respectful distance, don't they? But his whisper suggested something deeper, something I'd been blind to or chosen not to see. Had Sarah been unhappy? Had she needed something from me that I'd failed to provide? The questions multiplied in the darkness of my living room, each one sharper than the last, until I felt like I might drown in them. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, something I rarely did, and sat in the chair where I used to read the evening paper. Everything felt different now. The familiar comfort of my routine, my solitude, my carefully ordered life seemed suddenly fragile, built on assumptions I was no longer sure I could trust. Outside, the September wind rattled the windows, and I found myself thinking about all the phone calls from Sarah I'd PT short because I was tired, all the invitations I'd declined because I preferred my quiet evenings at home. I'd always told myself I was giving her space to live her own life, that constant contact would be intrusive, unwelcome. Now I wondered if what I'd called respect had actually been neglect, if what I'd called independence had actually been abandonment. Marcus's whisper had opened a door I wasn't sure I was brave enough to walk through, but I knew, even then, that I couldn't simply close it and pretend it had never happened. The funeral was over, but something had begun that day. A reckoning I'd spent years avoiding, a conversation with ghosts I wasn't ready to have. As I finally climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I carried with me the echo of those 4 words and the growing certainty that they were going to change everything I thought I knew about being Sarah's father. In the days following Sarah's funeral, I found myself doing something I'd rarely done while she was alive. I thought about her constantly. Not the woman she'd become, but the little girl she'd been, and somewhere in those memories, I began to see the pattern of distance that had defined our relationship from the very beginning. When Sarah was born, I was 31 and absolutely terrified. I'd held her exactly twice in the hospital, once when the nurse placed her in my arms immediately after delivery, and once more when we were leaving to go home. She was so impossibly small, so fragile, that I was convinced I'd somehow break her if I wasn't careful. My wife Linda seemed to understand instinctively how to hold her, how to comfort her, how to decode her different cries. I felt like an intruder in their perfect little world. So I did what I thought fathers were supposed to do. I worked. I worked long hours at the insurance office, building what I told myself was security for my family. I worked Ken's, telling Linda I was doing it for Sarah's college fund. I worked late, into the evenings, claiming I wanted to give them the best life possible. And in all that working, I somehow forgot to learn how to be present for the life I was supposedly building. Linda used to say I was too stern with Sarah, too quick to correct and slow to praise. When Sarah would run to show me a drawing she'd made, I'd glance at it and say, "That's nice, honey. Did you clean your room like I asked?" When she'd try to tell me about her day at school, I'd listen with half an ear while reading the newspaper, occasionally grunting acknowledgement without really hearing what she was saying. I thought I was teaching her discipline, responsibility, the value of hard work. I thought fathers were meant to be the steady, reliable foundation, while mothers provided the warmth and emotional connection. Nobody had ever taught me that children need both from both parents. Nobody had ever shown me that love spoken aloud is different from love assumed. As Sarah grew older, the distance between us grew too. She stopped bringing me her drawings. She stopped trying to tell me about her school day. When she had problems, and I'm sure she must have had problems, she took them to Linda. When she had achievements, she celebrated them with her friends. I became a peripheral figure in her life, present at dinner and on holidays, but absent from the daily rhythm of her growing up. I remember her high school graduation. She was valedictorian, something that filled me with pride, though I'm not sure I ever told her that directly. After the ceremony, her friends gathered around her with flowers and congratulations. Linda cried and hugged her and told her how proud she was. I shook Sarah's hand and said, "Well done. All that studying paid off." Even as I said it, I could see something dim in her eyes, some hope I hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. College took her 3 states away, and your relationship settled into an even more formal pattern. She'd call every few weeks, conversations that rarely lasted more than 10 minutes. She'd tell me about her classes, her job, the weather. I'd ask about her grades, her finances, whether she was being careful walking alone at night. We developed a script that allowed us to maintain contact without ever really connecting. When she brought Marcus home for the first time, during her senior year, I treated him the way I treated most people, with polite reserve. I asked him about his career plans, his family background, whether he intended to support Sarah in the manner she deserved. I thought I was being protective. Looking back, I wonder if I was simply maintaining the comfortable distance that had become my default way of relating to anyone who mattered. Their wedding was beautiful. Linda planned most of it, consulting with Sarah on every detail while I wrote the checks and showed up where I was told. During the father-daughter dance, Sarah looked up at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I love you, Daddy." I remember feeling surprised by the emotion in her voice, and I replied, "I love you too, sweetheart. Be happy." It was one of the few times I'd said those words to her aloud, and even then, they felt awkward in my mouth, like a language I'd never quite learned to speak fluently. After the wedding, our relationship settled into an even more distant rhythm. Holiday visits became our primary connection: Thanksgiving, Christmas, the occasional birthday dinner. Sarah would hug me when she arrived and when she left, but between those bookends, we talked about safe subjects: work, weather, current events, the house repairs I was always undertaking. I told myself this was normal. Daughters grow up, get married, start their own lives. Sons-in-law become the primary male figure in their world. Fathers step back and let their children be adults. But sitting in my quiet house after her funeral, I began to wonder if what I'd called normal was actually just neglect, wrapped in the comfortable fiction of giving her space. Linda, before she passed 5 years ago, used to say that Sarah needed more from me. "She's still your little girl," Linda would tell me. "She needs to know you're proud of her, that you think about her, that she matters to you beyond just being someone you're responsible for." I'd always dismissed these conversations, telling Linda she was being overly emotional, that Sarah knew I cared about her. But did she? In the weeks after the funeral, as I tried to inventory our relationship, I struggled to find moments when I'd made my love for her explicitly clear. I'd provided for her, certainly. I'd attended her important events, mostly. I'd been available when she had practical questions about taxes or insurance or home repairs. But when had I last told her I was proud of her? When had I last asked about her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that our relationship had been built on assumption rather than expression. I'd assumed she knew I loved her because I was her father. I'd assumed she understood my quiet pride because I'd never criticized her major life choices. I'd assumed that my steady presence in the background of her life was enough. Now, with Marcus's words echoing in my memory, I began to understand that assumption is not the same as communication, that being present is not the same as being connected, that providing for someone is not the same as nourishing them emotionally. I started to see our last conversation in a different light. She'd called me on a Tuesday evening in August, about 3 weeks before she died. She'd sounded tired, stressed about something at work. I'd asked if she was taking care of herself, reminded her to get enough sleep, suggested she talk to Marcus if she was having problems. The conversation lasted maybe 7 minutes. At the time, I'd felt like a good father for checking in, for offering practical advice. Now I wondered what I'd missed. Had she been reaching out for something more than my standard fatherly concern? Had she needed me to ask deeper questions, to create space for her to share whatever was really troubling her? The truth was becoming uncomfortably clear. I'd been Sarah's father in title and responsibility, but I'd never learned how to be her father in intimacy and connection. I'd loved her, I was certain of that. But I'd loved her from a distance, the way you might love a beautiful painting hanging on a wall. Admiring, protective, but never truly close enough to understand the intricate details that made it beautiful. And now she was gone, and I was left with the growing certainty that my distance, my careful, well-intentioned, utterly inadequate distance, had created a space in her life that I'd never even realized existed, a space that, according to Marcus, had somehow contributed to her death. The weight of that possibility was more than I thought I could bear, but I was beginning to understand I had no choice but to carry it. 3 days after the funeral, I decided I had to speak with Marcus directly. His whispered accusation had been eating at me like acid, and I couldn't go on without understanding what he'd meant. I drove to the house he and Sarah had shared, a modest colonial in a neighborhood I'd helped them find when they were first married, with no clear idea of what I was going to say. Marcus answered the door looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his face shadowed with stubble. For a moment, I saw him not as my daughter's husband or as the man who'd accused me, but as someone drowning in the same grief that was pulling me under. "Marcus," I said, my voice careful and measured. I was hoping we could talk. His expression hardened immediately, as if my presence had reminded him of something unpleasant. "About what?" he asked, not inviting me in, not stepping aside from the doorway. "About Sarah, about what you said at the funeral." I kept my voice low, gentle, trying not to sound confrontational, despite the anger that was beginning to simmer beneath my confusion. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see something working behind his eyes, some internal debate about whether to engage with me or simply shut the door. Finally, he stepped back slightly, though he didn't invite me in. "What about it?" "You said it was my fault. I need to understand what you meant by that." The words hung in the air between us like something physical, something we could both see and touch. Marcus's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, something that might have been guilt, and finally a kind of weary resignation. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, and there was something almost like pity in his voice that made my chest tighten with dread. "Know what?" "Marcus, if there's something I should understand about Sarah, about how she died, you need to tell me." He laughed, but it was a bitter sound, empty of any humor. "How she died? Jesus, Mr. Coleman. How about how she lived? How about how she struggled every single day with feeling like she wasn't good enough, like nothing she did mattered, like the one person whose approval she wanted most couldn't be bothered to notice her?" Each word hit me like a slap, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep listening. "I don't understand. I was always proud of Sarah. She knew that." "Did she? When's the last time you told her that? When's the last time you called her just to see how she was doing? When's the last time you asked her about anything deeper than the weather or her job?" I opened my mouth to respond, but realized I didn't have answers to his questions. Or rather, I had answers, but they weren't the kind I could speak aloud without confirming everything he was saying about me. Marcus must have seen something in my face because his expression softened slightly, though his voice remained hard. "She used to call me at work sometimes, crying because she'd tried to talk to you about something important, and you'd change the subject or cut the conversation short. She'd spend hours trying to figure out what she'd done wrong, why her own father seemed more comfortable talking to strangers than to her." I felt something crumbling inside my chest, some carefully constructed wall that had been holding back truths I wasn't ready to face. "I never meant—" I thought I was giving her space. I thought daughters were closer to their mothers. "Space?" Marcus's voice rose slightly, and I could see neighbors' curtains twitching in windows across the street. "She didn't need space from you. She needed connection. She needed to feel like she mattered to you as more than just an obligation." He paused, running his hands through his hair, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more devastating. "Do you know how she died, Mr. Coleman? Really died?" I felt my stomach drop. The official cause of death had been a heart arrhythmia, sudden, unexpected, one of those medical mysteries that sometimes claims young, healthy people without warning. "Her heart," I started to say. "Her heart gave out because she'd been taking diet pills. Prescription ones she got online because she was convinced she was too heavy, too ugly, too everything wrong. She'd been struggling with that for months, and every time she tried to talk to someone about how she was feeling, you were too busy or too distracted or too uncomfortable with emotion to really listen." The world seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself, trying to process what he was telling me. Sarah H. had been struggling, really struggling, and I'd missed it completely. Or worse, maybe I'd seen signs and chosen to ignore them. Because dealing with them would have required a level of emotional intimacy I'd never learned how to navigate. "I didn't know," I whispered, and even as I said it, I realized how inadequate those words were. Why didn't anyone tell me? "She didn't want to worry you. Even after everything, even after years of feeling invisible to you, she was still trying to protect you from having to deal with her problems." Marcus's voice broke slightly on the last words, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. We stood there in silence for several moments, both of us processing the weight of what had been said. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that I'd always loved Sarah, even if I'd been poor at expressing it. But every potential defense died in my throat because I could see the truth in Marcus's pain. I should have tried harder, I finally said, the words feeling inadequate even as I spoke them. Yes, Marcus replied simply. You should have. He paused, looking past me toward the street where Sarah used to walk their dog every evening. But it's too late now, isn't it? With that, he stepped back into the house and gently but firmly closed the door, leaving me standing on his porch with the weight of revelations I wasn't sure I could carry. I walked slowly back to my car, my legs feeling unsteady, my mind reeling with the implications of everything I'd just learned. The drive home passed in a blur. I kept thinking about Sarah's last months, trying to recall if there had been signs I'd missed. Had she seemed thinner the last time I'd seen her? Had there been something in her voice during our phone conversations that I'd dismissed as work stress or general life fatigue? When I got home, I sat in my car in the driveway for nearly an hour, unable to face going into the empty house. Marcus's words kept echoing in my head, reshaping every memory I had of my relations. Hip with Sarah. Conversations I'd thought were normal now seemed inadequate. Silences I'd interpreted as comfortable now felt charged with unspoken pain. I began to understand that Marcus's accusation at the funeral hadn't been the cruel lashing out of a grieving widower. It had been the truth, spoken by someone who'd watched the woman he loved struggle with wounds I'd inadvertently inflicted through years of emotional distance and benign neglect. The hardest part wasn't just learning that Sarah had been in pain, it was realizing that my own daughter hadn't felt safe enough to share that pain with me, that she'd protected me from her struggles even as those struggles were killing her, that in trying to be a strong, steady father, I'd somehow become unreachable, someone she loved but couldn't confide in. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my lawn, I finally went inside. The house felt different now, haunted not just by Sarah's absence, but by all the conversations we'd never had, all the support I'd never offered, all the love I'd felt, but never found the courage to express in ways she could truly receive. Marcus was right, it was too late now, but sitting in the growing darkness of my living room, I began to understand that while I couldn't save Sarah, I might still be able to save myself from the complete destruction of living with this knowledge. The question was whether I had the courage to face the full extent of what my distance had cost us both. After my conversation with Marcus, sleep became nearly impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, memories would surface, not the pleasant, nostalgic recollections that usually comfort the grieving, but sharp-edged fragments that cut deeper each time they appeared. I remembered Sarah's 8th grade science fair. She'd worked for weeks on a project about butterflies, their migration patterns, their life cycles, their role in pollination. She'd been so excited to show me her display, with its carefully mounted specimens and hand-drawn charts. When I arrived at the school gymnasium, she'd practically bounced with enthusiasm, pulling me toward her table. But my phone had rung just as we reached her project, a client with what seemed like an urgent question about his policy. I'd held up one finger to Sarah, mouthing, "Just a minute," and taken the call. It lasted 15 minutes. When I'd finally hung up and turned back to her display, Sarah's teacher was already announcing the winners. Sarah had earned 2nd place, but by then, her excitement had dimmed to a polite smile. "It's really impressive, honey," I'd said, glancing at her project while checking my watch. "You did a great job. Should we head home for dinner?" What I remembered now, with the cruel clarity that grief provides, was the way her shoulders had slumped just slightly when I'd answered that phone. The way she'd looked at the other parents who were taking pictures, asking detailed questions about their children's work, celebrating achievements with unrestrained enthusiasm. I'd been there, physically present, but I'd missed the moment that mattered to her. Another memory, Sarah's high school play. She'd landed the lead role in Our Town, Emily Webb, the young woman who dies and returns to observe her life. Even now, the irony of that choice felt like a knife turning in my chest. She'd been so nervous about opening night, had called me twice that week to make sure I'd be there. I'd arrived on time, taken my seat in the 3rd row. Sarah was luminous on stage, confident, moving, completely transformed from the shy teenager I lived with at home. During the final scene, when Eily asks to return to life for just one day, and then realizes how precious and overlooked ordinary moments are, I'd watched Sarah deliver her lines with such raw emotion that several people around me were crying. After the show, as other parents surrounded their children with flowers and praise, I'd approached Sarah with my typical measured approval. "You did very well," I'd told her. You remembered all your lines perfectly. Very professional. Professional. I'd use that word, professional, to describe my 17-year-old daughter's heartbreaking performance about the preciousness of human connection. Even Linda had looked at me with something like bewilderment, but I'd thought I was being complimentary, highlighting Sarah's competence and skill. The memories kept coming, each one a small indictment of my failure to understand what fatherhood really required. Sarah's college graduation, where I'd spent most of the reception networking with other parents about business opportunities instead of celebrating with her. Her promotion at work last year, which she'd mentioned in passing during a phone call, and I'd responded with advice about managing her finances rather than expressing pride in her achievement. I began to see patterns I'd been blind to before. How Sarah's calls to me had gradually become shorter and less frequent. How her visits home had taken on a dutiful quality, as if she were fulfilling an obligation rather than nurturing a relationship. How she'd stopped sharing details about her life, her dreams, her struggles, until our conversations had become scripted exchanges about surface topics. The worst memory came to me on a sleepless Tuesday night, about a week after Marcus had told me about Sarah's diet pills. I remembered a visit she and Marcus had made the previous Christmas. Sarah had seemed quieter than usual, more subdued. At one point, while Marcus was outside clearing snow from my driveway, she'd sat beside me on the couch while I watched the evening news. "Dad," she'd said softly, "do you ever think about Mom? About how she used to worry about everyone?" I'd glanced at her briefly before turning back to the television. "Your mother was a worrier, that's true. Sometimes I think she made problems bigger than they needed to be by dwelling on them." Sarah had been quiet for a moment, and then she'd said, "But maybe sometimes people need someone to worry about them, to really pay attention when something's wrong." "People are stronger than they think," I'd replied, still watching the news. "Most problems work themselves out if you don't make a big fuss about them." Now, lying in my bed in the dark, I could see that conversation with horrifying clarity. Sarah had been trying to tell me something, trying to open a door to a deeper connection, maybe even trying to ask for help. And I'd shut her down with my philosophy of emotional self-reliance, my belief that people should solve their own problems without burdening others. Had she been struggling with her self-image even then? Had she been looking for permission to share her pain, to ask for support? Had that been her attempt to test whether I could handle her vulnerability? And had I failed that test so completely that she'd never tried again? I got up and walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water I didn't want, stood at the sink, looking out at the backyard where Sarah used to play as a child. I could almost see her out there, 7 years old, pushing her doll on the swing set I'd assembled for her birthday. She'd always wanted me to come outside and push her higher, but I'd usually been inside reading the paper or watching television, calling out through the window that she was doing fine on her own. The pattern had been there from the beginning, hadn't it? My belief that independence was the greatest gift I could give her. My conviction that teaching her to be self-sufficient was more valuable than teaching her she could depend on others. My assumption that love was best expressed through providing and protecting, rather than through presence and emotional availability. I thought about all the fathers I'd known growing up. Men of my father's generation who showed love through work, who expressed care through provision, who demonstrated affection through steady presence rather than words or physical comfort. I'd modeled myself after them, never questioning whether that style of fatherhood was what my daughter actually needed. But Sarah had been born into a different world, a generation that valued emotional intelligence and open communication. While I'd been showing love in the only way I knew how, she'd been learning from her friends, from television, from the culture around her that love could be expressed more directly, more intimately. The tragedy wasn't just that I'd failed to give her what she needed. It was that I'd never even realized she needed something different from what I was offering. I'd thought I was being a good father by being consistent, reliable, financially responsible. I'd had no idea that she was starving for something I didn't even know existed: emotional intimacy, verbal affirmation, the kind of deep connection that transcends duty and obligation. Standing in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, I finally understood what Marcus had meant when he'd said it was my fault. Not that I'd caused Sarah's death directly, but that I'd created an environment where she felt she couldn't share her struggles, couldn't ask for help, couldn't trust that her pain would be met with understanding rather than advice to be stronger. I'd taught her, through years of subtle messages, that problems were meant to be solved alone, that emotions were meant to be managed privately, that needing support was a sign of weakness rather than inhumanity. And so when she'd started struggling with her self-image, when she'd begun the dangerous cycle of diet pills and self-hatred, she'd faced it alone, protecting me from the burden of her pain, even as that pain was destroying her. The memories weren't finished with me yet. There would be more sleepless nights, more moments of recognition, more opportunities to see how completely I'd misunderstood what it meant to love my daughter well. But that night, standing in the darkness of my kitchen, I finally began to grasp the true scope of what I'd lost. Not just Sarah herself, but all the conversations we'd never had, all the closeness we'd never shared, all the ways I might have known and helped and loved her if I'd only understood that being her father required more than just being present in her life. The weight of my realizations about Sarah became unbearable in isolation. I needed to understand more about her life, her struggles, the person she'd been when I wasn't around. So I began reaching out to her friends, something I'd never done while she was alive, another small failure that stung even as I recognized it. I started with Jennifer, Sarah's college roommate, who'd kept in touch with her over the years. I found her number in Sarah's old address book and called on a Thursday evening, my hands actually trembling as I dialed. "Mr. Coleman?" Jennifer's voice was surprised, gentle. "I'm so sorry about Sarah. She was such a wonderful person." "Thank you." "Jennifer, I was hoping—" I know this might sound strange, but I'm trying to understand more about Sarah's life, about who she was with her friends. I feel like there's so much I didn't know. There was a pause, and I could hear Jennifer choosing her words carefully. She was one of the most caring people I've ever known. She was always worried about everyone else, always trying to make sure everyone around her was okay. Was she happy? In recent years, I mean? Another pause, longer this time. She loved Marcus very much, and then she was proud of her job, her house, the life they'd built together. But Jennifer's voice trailed off. But what? She struggled sometimes with feeling like she wasn't good enough. Like no matter what she accomplished, it wasn't quite right somehow. She was always comparing herself to other people, always worried she was disappointing the people who mattered to her. My chest tightened as Jennifer continued. She didn't like to talk about her family much. I always got the sense that there were complicated feelings there, but she was very private about it. Complicated feelings. Private about her family. Each phrase felt like another small wound, confirmation that I'd been relegated to a compartment of Sarah's life that she'd kept sealed off from the people who actually knew her well. I called 3 more of Sarah's friends over the next few days. The conversations followed similar patterns, warm memories of Sarah's kindness and humor, followed by careful admissions that she'd struggled with self-doubt, that she'd been intensely private about her relationship with her father, that she'd often seemed to be trying to prove herself worthy of love she wasn't sure she deserved. The most devastating conversation was with Rachel, a coworker who'd become one of Sarah's closest friends in recent years. Rachel agreed to meet me for coffee, and I could see she'd been crying when she arrived at the small cafe we'd chosen. "Sarah mentioned you sometimes," Rachel said after we'd ordered, and something in her tone made me brace myself for what was coming. "What did she say?" "She talked about wanting to be closer to you, about feeling like she'd never figured out how to have a real conversation with you." Rachel wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if trying to warm herself. "She used to say she felt like she was performing whenever she talked to you, trying to be the daughter you wanted instead of just being herself." I felt something break inside my chest. "What do you mean, performing?" "She'd practice phone calls to you sometimes. She'd think about what to say, what topics would be safe, how to keep things light and positive so you wouldn't worry or get uncomfortable." Rachel's voice grew softer. "She was always afraid of being too much for people, of needing too much attention or support." The image of Sarah rehearsing conversations with me, editing herself to fit what she thought I could handle, was almost unbearable. How had I become someone my own daughter felt she needed to perform for? How had I made her feel that her authentic self, with all her struggles and needs and vulnerabilities, was something I couldn't accept? "Did she ever talk about having problems with eating, with her weight?" I forced myself to ask. Rachel nodded slowly. "The last few months, yeah. She'd started obsessing about her appearance, convinced she was overweight, even though she looked beautiful. She was taking those pills, working out constantly, barely eating some days. Rachel looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I tried to talk to her about it, to get her to see someone, but she said she had it under control. She said she didn't want to worry anyone with her problems. Why didn't she feel like she could tell me, or Marcus? She did tell Marcus eventually, but she was afraid he'd think she was weak, or vain, or, I don't know, just too much trouble. Rachel paused, clearly debating whether to say more. As for you, she said you'd always taught her that people should solve their own problems, that asking for help was giving up. I sat back in my chair, feeling like I'd been physically struck. Had I really taught her that? Had my emphasis on self-reliance, my discomfort with emotional displays, my belief that people should be strong and independent, somehow translated into the message that needing help was failure? I never meant, I started, but the words died in my throat. Intent didn't matter now. What mattered was the impact, the way my well-meaning philosophy had isolated my daughter when she needed support most. After coffee with Rachel, I drove home in a daze. Each conversation I'd had with Sarah's friends had painted a picture of a woman I barely recognized. Someone who'd been struggling with deep insecurities. Someone who'd felt she had to earn love through performance. Someone who'd been taught that vulnerability was weakness and independence was the highest virtue. That evening, I finally worked up the courage to call Marcus directly. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice wary when he heard mine. Marcus, I've been talking to some of Sarah's friends. I'm trying to understand. I need to know more about what she was going through. Why? His voice was flat, emotionally exhausted. Because I failed her, and I need to understand how completely I failed her. There was a long silence, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice had softened slightly. She loved you, you know. Even when she was frustrated with you, even when she felt like you didn't really see her, she loved you. That makes it worse, not better. I know. Another pause. She started having panic attacks about 6 months ago, about her appearance, about whether people liked her, about whether she was good enough at her job. She'd gotten it into her head that she was fat, ugly, disappointing everyone around her. Marcus's voice grew quieter. I tried to help her, but she kept saying she needed to handle it herself, that depending on other people was weak. When I suggested therapy, she said therapy was for people who couldn't cope with life. My own words echoed back through my daughter's voice. How many times had I dismissed therapy, counseling, any form of outside support as unnecessary for people who were strong enough to handle their own problems? How many times had I reinforced the message that needing help was somehow shameful? The diet pills were supposed to be temporary, Marcus continued. Just to lose a few pounds, she said. But they became this obsession. She was taking more and more, barely sleeping, her heart racing all the time. When I confronted her about it, she promised to stop. But she was hiding them, ordering them online, lying to me about taking them. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone call me? Because she made me promise not to. She said you'd be disappointed in her for being weak, for not being able to handle her problems like an adult. Marcus's voice broke slightly. She was more afraid of disappointing you than she was of dying. I hung up the phone and sat in my living room as darkness fell around me, finally understanding the full scope of what my emotional distance had cost. I hadn't just missed my daughter's struggle, I had created the conditions that made her struggle inevitable. My philosophy of self-reliance had become her prison. My discomfort with vulnerability had become her shame. My definition of strength had become her death sentence. The truth I'd been seeking was more terrible than I'd imagined, but at least now I knew. Sarah had died not just from diet pills, but from the isolation those pills represented. The isolation I had taught her was normal, healthy, the way strong people handled their problems. She had died protecting me from the burden of loving her completely, and that protection had killed her as surely as the chemicals she'd been putting into her body. After learning the truth about Sarah's struggles, I found myself unable to function normally. The weight of understanding, really understanding, how thoroughly I'd failed her pressed down on me like a physical force. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely manage the simple tasks of daily life. But somewhere in that darkness, I began to do something I'd never done before. I started Writing to my daughter. It began on a sleepless Tuesday night, about 3 weeks after my conversation with Marcus. I'd been sitting in my kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, when I noticed Sarah's old address book on the counter, the one I'd been using to contact her friends. Next to it was a pen and a pad of paper I'd used to jot down phone numbers. Without really thinking about it, I picked up the pen and wrote at the top of a blank page, "Dear Sarah." Then I sat there for nearly an hour, the pen motionless in my hand, trying to figure out what came next. What do you say to a daughter who's gone? What do you say when you've spent 32 years not saying the things that mattered most? How do you begin a conversation that should have started decades ago but now can never be completed? Finally, I began to write. Dear Sarah, I held you for the first time on September 15th, 1991, at 3:47 in the morning. You weighed 6 pounds, 4 ounces, and you had the most perfect tiny fingernails I'd ever seen. The nurse put you in my arms, and I was terrified I'd drop you, but you looked up at me with these dark, serious eyes, and for just a moment, I felt like you could see straight into my heart. I should have told you about that moment. I should have told you that from the very first second you existed, you were the most beautiful, perfect thing I'd ever seen. I should have told you that every day of your life, but I didn't know how. I thought love was something you showed through actions, not words. I thought providing for you and protecting you was enough. I was wrong. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if 32 years of unsaid things were finally finding their way out of me onto paper. I wrote about her first steps, her first day of school, the way she used to hum while she colored at the kitchen table. I wrote about Mom. Ents. I'd forgotten I'd remembered, tiny details that had somehow stayed with me, even though I'd never shared them with her. The first letter was 12 pages long by the time I finished it at dawn. I folded it carefully and put it in an envelope, writing Sarah on the front in my careful handwriting. Then I placed it on my desk and went to bed, sleeping more deeply than I had in weeks. The next night, I wrote another letter. This one was harder, an apology for all the school events I'd missed, all the phone calls I'd cut short, all the times I'd chosen work over presents. I wrote about the science fair when I'd answered my phone instead of celebrating her second-place finish. I wrote about her high school play, admitting that calling her performance professional had been my clumsy way of avoiding the emotion I'd felt watching her become someone magnificent on that stage. I was proud of you, I wrote. I was so proud I could barely breathe, but I didn't know how to say that without crying, and I thought fathers weren't supposed to cry, especially not in front of their daughters. I thought I was supposed to be strong and steady and unemotional. I thought that's what you needed from me. I didn't realize you needed to see that you could move me to tears, that your accomplishments mattered to me more than anything else in the world. Night after night, I continued writing. Each letter explored a different aspect of our relationship, a different failure, a different missed opportunity for connection. I wrote about how I'd interpreted her quietness as contentment when it had actually been resignation. How I'd mistaken her independence for strength when it had been loneliness. How I'd praised her for not being needy when what I should have done was create space for her needs, whatever they were. The letters became a kind of archaeology of my failures as a father. Each one excavated another layer of misunderstanding, another moment when I'd chosen the easy path of emotional distance over the harder work of true intimacy. But they also became something else. A way of finally saying all the things I'd kept locked inside my heart for 3 decades. In one letter, I wrote about her wedding day. When you walked down that aisle in your grandmother's dress, looking so beautiful and grown up and sure of yourself, I wanted to stop everything and tell you how amazing you were. I wanted to tell you that watching you become the woman you'd become was the greatest privilege of my life. Instead, I stood there trying not to cry, trying to be dignified, trying to be the father I thought you needed instead of the father you deserved. In another, I addressed her struggles with self-image. If I could go back and change one thing, it would be this. I would tell you every single day that you were beautiful exactly as you were. I would make sure you knew that your worth had nothing to do with how you looked, or what you accomplished, or whether you met some impossible standard you'd set for yourself. I would tell you that you were worthy of love simply because you existed, simply because you were mine. As the weeks passed, the letters began to change. The early ones had been full of regret and apology, but gradually they became something more. a real conversation with the daughter I'd never learned how to talk to when she was alive. I wrote about my childhood, about my own father's emotional distance and how I'd unconsciously repeated patterns I'd never questioned. I wrote about my fears, my insecurities, my own struggles with feeling adequate as a father. I think I was afraid that if I got too close to you, if I let myself love you as completely as I wanted to, something would happen and I'd lose you, I wrote in one letter. The irony is that by trying to protect myself from that pain, I lost you anyway, not to death, but to distance. I lost years of really knowing you, I being part of your life, really being the father you needed me to be. The letters piled up on my desk, 20, 30, 40 pages of conversation with a ghost, of love finally given voice, of apologies that would never be received but somehow still needed to be spoken. Writing them became the most important thing in my life, the only thing that made the weight of my grief bearable. In what turned out to be the last letter I wrote, I tried to capture everything I'd learned, everything I wished I could change. I know now that being a father isn't about being strong or distant or emotionally controlled. It's about being present, really present, in ways I never learned how to be. It's about creating space for your child to be vulnerable, to struggle, to need support without shame. It's about saying, I love you, not just with actions, but with words, over and over, until your child never has to wonder if they're worthy of that love. I wrote about how I would parent differently if I had the chance, how I would choose connection over protection, vulnerability over strength, presence over providing. I wrote about the conversations we would have if she could come back, the questions I would ask, the support I would offer, the love I would express without reservation or fear. When I finally put down the pen after writing that last letter, I had filled nearly 200 pages with words I'd never been able to speak aloud. The letters wouldn't bring Sarah back, wouldn't undo the damage my emotional distance had caused, wouldn't save her from the isolation that had contributed to her death. But they had saved me, in a way, saved me from drowning in regret without ever acknowledging the love that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of fear and learned emotional constraint. I gathered all the letters together and tied them with a ribbon I found in Sarah's old craft supplies. Then I placed them in a box on my bookshelf next to a photo of her. From college, one of the few pictures I had where she was laughing, really laughing, her whole face bright with joy. The letters were finished, but the conversation they had started was just beginning. For the first time since Sarah's death, I began to understand that grief could be more than just an ending. It could also be a kind of beginning, a chance to learn how to love better, even if that love could only be expressed to memory and silence, and the hope that somehow, somewhere, she could finally hear me saying all the things I should have said when she was alive to receive them. It was a cold evening in November, nearly 3 months after Sarah's funeral, when I heard the soft knock on my front door. I'd been sitting in my reading chair, not actually reading, but holding a book as a kind of prop for the loneliness that had become my constant companion. When I opened the door, I found Amy standing on my porch, Sarah's best friend from college, someone I'd met only a handful of times over the years. Amy looked nervous, uncertain, as if she'd been debating whether to knock for several minutes. She was holding a small wrapped package in her hands, and her eyes were red-rimmed in the way that suggested recent tears. "Mr. Coleman," she said softly, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I have something of Sarah's that I thought you should have." I invited her in, offered her coffee, went through the motions of hospitality, while my heart raced with curiosity and dread about what she might have brought me. We sat in my living room, the same room where I'd written all those letters to Sarah, and Amy placed the package carefully on the coffee table between us. "Before I give this to you," she said, "I need to tell you something. About Sarah, about how she felt about you." I braced myself for another revelation about my failures, another confirmation of the damage my emotional distance had caused. But Amy's next words caught me completely off guard. "She loved you so much, Mr. Coleman, more than you probably realize, and she defended you constantly." Defended me? The word seemed to hang in the air between us like something I couldn't quite grasp. "What do you mean?" "People used to say things sometimes, about how distant you were, how you never seemed very involved in her life. Her mother's friends, some of our college friends who met you at graduation, they'd make comments about how formal you seemed, how hard it was to have a conversation with you." Amy paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah would get so angry when people talked like that. She'd tell them they didn't understand. that you were a good man who'd worked hard to give her everything she needed. She'd say you showed love differently than other fathers, but that didn't make it less real. I felt something shift in my chest, not the sharp pain I'd grown accustomed to, but something softer, more complex. She said that? All the time, especially after her mom died. She'd talk about how you'd never missed a mortgage payment, never forgotten her birthday, never failed to be there when she really needed practical help. She said you were the most reliable person she knew, that she could always count on you to be steady and strong. Amy reached for the package, unwrapping it slowly. Inside was a small journal with a blue leather cover, worn soft with age and use. She kept this diary sporadically over the years, not every day, but when things were important to her, when she wanted to remember something or work through her feelings about it. Amy, I'm not sure I should read her private thoughts. She would want you to. After she died, Marcus found it and asked me to read through it to see if there was anything that might help him understand what she was going through. There are entries about you, Mr. Coleman, things you need to know. She the journal to a page marked with a small piece of paper. This is from last Christmas, after she visited you. Amy cleared her throat and began to read. Had dinner with Dad tonight. He made his famous spaghetti sauce, the one Mom used to tease him about because he's so secretive about the recipe. He seemed tired, maybe lonely, though he'd never admit it. I wanted to ask him how he's really doing, whether he misses Mom as much as I think he does, whether he ever feels isolated in that big house all by himself. But we talked about safe things instead. My job, the weather, whether I need new tires on my car. It's like we have this script we follow that keeps us both comfortable but never lets us get close to anything that really matters. The thing is, I know he loves me. I can see it in the way he keeps Mom's pictures up, in how he still makes enough food for 3 people even though it's just him now, in how he always asks if Marcus is treating me well. Dad doesn't know how to say, I love you, with words, but he's been saying it with actions my whole life. I just wish I knew how to bridge that gap between us, how to let him know that I love him too, that I see all the ways he's taken care of me even when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Amy's voice was gentle as she read, but each word felt like a revelation. Sarah had seen my love, had recognized it even in my clumsy, inadequate expressions. She'd understood something about me that I'd never been able to articulate about myself. Amy turned to another marked page. This one is from about 2 years ago, after her promotion at work. Called Dad to tell him about the promotion. He congratulated me and immediately started asking practical questions, whether it came with better benefits, whether I'd have to work longer hours, whether I was sure I could handle the additional responsibility. Marcus got frustrated. Later, said Dad should have been more excited, more emotionally supportive, but I think Marcus doesn't understand that Dad was being supportive in his own way. He was making sure I'd thought through all the practical implications, making sure I was prepared for the challenges ahead. That's how he shows he cares, by trying to protect me from potential problems. I know other daughters have fathers who say, I'm so proud of you, or you're amazing, or all those emotional things, and sometimes I wish Dad could say those words too, but I also know that when he asks whether I have good insurance, or whether my car is running well, or whether I'm saving enough money, he's really saying, I want you to be safe and secure and okay. That's his love language, even if it's not mine. Tears were running down my cheeks now, and I didn't try to stop them. For the first time since Sarah's death, they weren't tears of pure regret and self-recrimination. They were something more complicated. Grief mixed with gratitude, sorrow mixed with a kind of wonder that my daughter had understood me better than I'd understood myself. Amy closed the journal, but held it carefully in her lap. There are other entries, some where she talks about wishing you two were closer, wishing she knew how to have deeper conversations with you. But Mr. Coleman, she never doubted that you loved her. Even when she was struggling, even when she felt like she couldn't talk to you about her problems, she never questioned whether you cared about her. Why didn't she tell me these things when she was alive? I asked, my voice hoarse with emotion. Because she was afraid of making you uncomfortable. She knew you struggled with emotional conversations and she didn't want to put you in a position where you felt pressured to be someone you weren't. Amy leaned forward slightly. She was protecting you, Mr. Coleman, Even when she needed support herself, she was trying to protect you from having to deal with emotions you weren't comfortable handling. The irritor. Oni was devastating and beautiful at the same time. Sarah had been protecting me from her emotional needs not because she didn't trust my love, but because she understood my limitations and loved me anyway. She'd been managing our relationship carefully, trying to preserve the connection we did have rather than risk losing it by asking for more than she thought I could give. Amy placed the journal on the coffee table and pushed it gently toward me. She would want you to have this, and she would want you to know that even though she wished things could have been different between you two, she never stopped loving you. She never stopped being grateful for the father you were, even if he wasn't always the father she needed. After Amy left, I sat holding Sarah's journal for a long time before I found the courage to open it. Reading her private thoughts felt like a sacred act, a final gift she was giving me. The chance to see myself through her eyes, to understand that love had existed in our relationship even when connection had failed. I will never forget the words my son-in-law whispered to me that day. "This is all your fault, old man." They have lived inside me ever since, like a splinter I can't pull out, no matter how many times I try. His voice, low and sharp, slips into my thoughts at the quietest moments. When I wake in the middle of the night, when I walk past her old photographs, even when I'm in the garden pulling weeds, I hear him again. That whisper, so soft no one else could hear, shouted louder than anything anyone else said that day. At first, I tried to fight it. I told myself he was just angry, just broken with grief, looking for someone to blame. But the longer I sat with it, the harder it became to push it away, because deep down there was a part of me that already feared he was right. And now, I live with those words, not as a sentence, not as a judgment, carved in stone, but as a reminder of the life I lived, the mistakes I made, and the love I failed to fully give. If you've ever carried words like that, words you couldn't forget, even if you tried, then you know how heavy silence can be. And if you've ever felt something similar, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Sometimes just knowing others understand helps lighten the load, even if only a little. The truth is, I can't change the past. I can't go back and hold her tighter. I can't undo the years when my pride kept me quiet, when my work kept me away, when my fear of tenderness disguised itself as strength. I can't rewrite the evenings I missed, or the birthdays I let slip by with just a phone call. What I can do is remember. What I can do is keep her close in the only way I have left. Most mornings now, I sit by the window with a cup of tea, and I talk to her. Not out loud, usually, just in my heart. I tell her the things I never said when I had the chance. I tell her I love her, that I'm proud of her, that I wish I had been braver about showing it. Sometimes I imagine her answering back, not in words exactly, but in the way memory answers us, with a smile I once saw, a laugh I can still hear if I close my eyes. It's not much, but it's something, and in the emptiness she left behind, even something feels like grace. Her husband's words could have destroyed me completely, and maybe, for a while, they did. In those first weeks after the funeral, I carried nothing but guilt. I replayed every scene of my fatherhood, looking for proof of my failure, and there was plenty of it, too much of it. But over time, I began to see something else hiding underneath. She may have been hurt by me, she may have longed for more than I gave, but still, she loved me. I know that now. Her best friend told me how often she defended me when others called me distant. She said my daughter always believed I meant more than I showed, that I just didn't know how to say it. That small piece of truth has become my anchor, because it means she saw me, not just the father who failed, but the man who was trying in the only way he knew how. So now I live with both realities, the ache of what I failed to give, and the quiet gratitude that she loved me anyway. It's a strange thing carrying two truths at once, regret in one hand, love in the other. They weigh differently, but you can't put either one down. Some days the regret feels heavier, dragging me low. Other days, the memory of her love gives me enough light to keep going. I suppose that is what it means to be a father. Even when the child is gone, you keep carrying them. You carry the good, and you carry the bad. You carry it all. There are nights I wake suddenly, my heart pounding, because I hear her voice calling, "Dad." For a split second, I believe she's here, alive, maybe needing me, but then I remember, and the silence after is unbearable. That's when I whisper back to her. I tell her I'm here. I tell her I didn't stop being her father when she left this world. The first time I did that, I cried until dawn. But strangely, it helped, because I realized maybe the whispers that broke me don't have to be the last ones I hear. Maybe I can send whispers back to her, in love, instead of blame. My son-in-law will never take back what he said. I doubt we'll ever speak of it again. To him, I will always be the father who wasn't enough. And maybe in his eyes, that's true. But I no longer let his whisper be the only story. The story I choose to live now is the one my daughter left me with. Imperfect love, yes, but love nonetheless. She may not have heard the words as often as she deserved, but she knew. She knew. I hold on to that. People ask me sometimes how I keep going. The answer is simple, though not easy. I keep talking to her. I keep writing the letters I'll never send. I keep holding on to the smallest details, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her hand in mine when she was little. And when the whisper of blame returns, as it always does, I remind myself, it broke me once, but it doesn't own me anymore. If I've learned anything through this, it's that silence is its own betrayal. Not saying the words, not showing the love, those become regrets you cannot bury. So now I speak, even if it's too late for her ears. I speak to her picture on the wall. I speak in prayers at night. I speak when I pass the places we once walked together, and in those quiet moments I imagine she hears me, maybe not in this world, but somewhere beyond it. Maybe she knows now what I never said enough, that she was my daughter, my only daughter, and that I loved her in ways too deep for my clumsy words to carry. The whisper at her funeral broke me, but the whispers I now send back to her, they keep me alive. They are how I stay her father, even in her absence. They are how I endure the blame, the regret, the grief. Because in the end, it wasn't all my fault. It wasn't all anyone's fault. It was life, with all its mess and silence and missed chances. And though I can't change how it ended, I can change how I carry it. And so I carry it with love.